Let's talk about a man whose discoveries didn't just shake up science, they completely shifted our very place in the cosmos. It's an incredible story of genius, defiance, and a huge clash between radical new ideas and centuries of authority.
And yet it moves. You've probably heard this famous line. These are the legendary words Galileo supposedly whispered right after the Catholic Church forced him to deny that the Earth orbits the Sun. It's the ultimate act of quiet rebellion.
But is that really what happened? Did he actually say it? And more importantly, how did this one guy with a souped-up telescope end up going head-to-head with one of the most powerful institutions on the planet? Well, that's the story we're going to dig into. To really understand Galileo's revolution, we have to start at the end of his public life, right at the moment of his greatest crisis.
So, picture the scene. It's 1633 in Rome. This isn't some friendly academic debate. Nope. This is a heavyweight showdown. In one corner, you've got the full might of the church, which for centuries decided not just matters of faith, but the very layout of the heavens. And in the other corner, one man, Galileo Galilei.
And get this, he's nearly 70 years old. He's frail, he's not in good health, and he's facing an absolutely impossible choice. He was threatened with torture, and in the end, forced to publicly renounce the work that had defined his entire life.
So what was this incredibly dangerous idea all about? Heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth and all the other planets go around the Sun. Now, Copernicus had proposed it mathematically, but it was Galileo's observations that made it feel real. And for the Church, this was a huge problem. It went against Holy Scripture, which put a fixed, unmoving Earth right at the center of God's creation.
But look, this showdown didn't just happen overnight. It was a slow burn, building up for over 20 years. It started with his mind-blowing discoveries, then escalated to a formal warning from the church, and finally, it all exploded with one single book that basically made his trial a sure thing. Okay, so let's rewind. To really get why he was so convinced, why he was willing to risk it all, we need to see what he saw. Let's look through his telescope at the discoveries that literally broke the old universe.
Before Galileo, the universe was, well, neat and tidy. According to Aristotle and Ptolemy, the heavens were perfect, made of some special divine stuff, totally different from our messy, flawed Earth. And of course, everything revolved around us. But then Galileo aimed his telescope at the sky, and that perfect, elegant model just started to crumble.
First, he looked at the moon. Whoa! It wasn't some smooth, polished crystal ball. It had mountains and craters. It looked like Earth. Then he saw that the sun, this supposedly flawless orb, had dark spots that moved across its face. The heavens were not perfect. They were not unchanging. And then came the knockout blows. He found 4 tiny stars circling Jupiter. This was a complete bombshell. Here was definitive proof that things in the sky could orbit something other than Earth. And the nail in the coffin? He saw that Venus went through a full set of phases, just like our moon. This was only possible if Venus orbited the sun. It was mathematically impossible in the old Earth-centered model. Game over. And this gets to the absolute core of what Galileo was all about. He wasn't just finding new stuff. He was pushing a whole new way to think. He argued that to understand the universe, you don't just read what the ancient authorities wrote. You have to look for yourself. And the language the universe is written in, as he put it, it's the language of mathematics. So, armed with all this evidence, Galileo just couldn't stay quiet. He decided to write a book, a dialogue that would lay out all the arguments for everyone to see, and what ended becoming the key piece of evidence against him. So he decides to write this book, but he knew he had to be clever. He couldn't just come out and declare that the sun-centered model was fact, not with the church watching. So he framed the whole thing as a debate, a dialogue presenting both sides of the argument, letting the reader decide. He sets it up with 3 characters. You've got Salviati, the sharp, brilliant scientist who argues for Galileo's views. You have Segredo, the smart, open-minded guy who's listening to the arguments. And then you have Simplicio, the guy who defends the old Earth-centered view. And this, right here, is where Galileo made a critical error. You see, the Pope at the time, Urban VIII, had actually been a friend and supporter of Galileo. But he told Galileo that if he wrote the book, he had to include the Pope's personal argument. Galileo did, but he gave that argument to Simplicio, the character who gets constantly outsmarted and, frankly, comes across as a fool.
And the name Simplicio sounds an awful lot like simpleton. The Pope was furious. It felt like a personal insult, and that friendship was completely over.
So the Pope felt betrayed. The gloves came off, and the Inquisition was called in. Which brings us right back to where we started. The trial and, ultimately, Galileo's legacy.
The verdict was just crushing. He was found vehemently suspect of heresy, forced to get on his knees and publicly deny the truth that he had seen with his own eyes. He spent the last 9 years of his life as a prisoner in his own home.
But here's the most incredible part of the whole story. He wasn't really silenced. You can't imprison a mind like that. Forbidden from writing about the heavens, he turned his genius to the laws of motion right here on Earth. While under house arrest, he wrote what many think is his greatest work, smuggling the manuscript out to be published. He was literally laying the groundwork for Isaac Newton and all of modern physics.
So, his legacy is just immense. It was Stephen Hawking who said Galileo is perhaps more responsible than any other person for the birth of modern science. And it's because he didn't just discover new things about the universe, he gave us a whole new way to discover them.
In his own lifetime, Galileo was defeated. He was condemned and silenced, but his observations were undeniable. His methods were revolutionary. The truth he uncovered couldn't be kept under house arrest forever. And in the end, the Earth does move.
Galileo's story leaves us with a huge question, one that's just as relevant today as it was 400 years ago. When powerful new knowledge clashes with deeply held beliefs, who gets to decide what's true? It's a conflict that doesn't just define the history of science, but the ongoing story of human progress itself.